In this episode of the Omega Podcast, we have an electrifying conversation on transportation engineering with an expert engineer. This discussion highlights the implications for roadway infrastructure for autonomous and electric vehicles, safety protocols, traffic signals, quality assurance, and much more. Let's launch into this iconic discussion.
Welcome to the Omega Podcast with Dan, who has 30 years of experience in a wide variety of transportation planning and engineering projects. Dan brings a deep level of expertise to public and private clients. His experience spans a wide variety of engineering work, from the study and design of roadway, pedestrian, and bicycle facilities to large highways. He is skilled at listening to a community's needs and collaborating with them to find a best fit solution. He is a senior project manager at Tighe Bond and an active member of the Boston and national chapters of ASCE's Transportation and Development Institute and the Active Transportation Committee. Dan, it is such a pleasure to have you on the Omega Podcast.
Keenan, it's great to be here. I look forward to having our conversation.
Fantastic. And again, I am super stoked and excited to dive deep into the realm of transportation engineering and to really understand the intricacies and the challenges, but also the opportunities this particular field presents. But to kick off our conversation, why did you choose to work in transportation engineering?
I actually went to college to study engineering. I wasn't quite sure what type of engineering I was going to do. Actually thought about a couple of different disciplines in engineering before I settled on civil engineering. And then through my co-op experience, one at a company that does transportation engineering, I really did enjoy, doing roadway design, doing roadway layout, utility coordination, and the different elements that make up a roadway project. So I just stuck with it and I've run with it.
Awesome. I think it's so important that you continued that journey and you started with something and you continued throughout your career. And I think throughout many individuals' career, they find it challenging to stay in one particular field. And you did that very successfully. But as a senior project manager, there are specific management tools and leadership styles that are very effective to be, I would say, successful in your role. What tools do you use to improve, to be the best transportation manager that you can be?
Well, one thing I like to prioritize is the development of staff engineers and project engineers that I work with in order to, provide technical guidance and development for them, to encourage them to look at the developed guidelines, the standard practices, to encourage them to find answers to the point that they can, certainly to fill in the blanks whenever necessary, but to do less micromanaging and to give them a little more room to run and find those answers. Because by doing that, they learn it better, basically.
Micromanaging can be very detrimental to other individuals, because I think if you're a macro manager where you're able to kind of see the big picture and just kind of give leadway throughout the project scope, it's much easier versus trying to look at every single daily task, because it can be tiresome. And there's definitely a lot of reports and studies that have been done that micromanagement isn't necessarily the best option.
I think if we're looking at project management specifically, certainly a successful project starts with proper project planning. And whenever we do a proposal, we sit down and we go through the scope of the project and we figure out what needs to be done and which disciplines need to be involved, whether it's, survey, geotechnical, hydraulics and hydrology, all the different disciplines that play into the design of a roadway or a bridge or whatever the project is. And we develop a list of those scope items and how many hours, and, develop a cost estimate for what needs to take place, so that when we start a project, we've got an expectation of what it's going to take for successful completion, trying to head off any kind of obstacles or hazards along the way. And then just following that plan once the project gets started. Talking specifically about transportation engineering design, the tools that we use are really design guidelines prepared by different agencies, Federal Highway Administration, Massachusetts Department of Transportation, and other departments of transportation, depending on where the project is, as well as other more recent guidelines. You talk about the evolution. The big one has been the AASHTO manual, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. And that really got its start back in the 50s when the interstate was developed and constructed. And it's a very auto-centric manual and is focused on automobile traffic. From there, there are other organizations that have gotten involved, and certainly the industry is driving towards what we call a complete street, a street that handles and accommodates, multiple users, not just the automobile. It includes transit, includes bicycles, includes pedestrians, and is a safe place for all of these different transportation modes to interact. So those are kind of the design tools that we use. And we've gone from manual drafting on vellum or mylar with ink and little eradicators to erase stuff that we need to change to, going full on AutoCAD design, where we can now do the design in AutoCAD, and it's a quicker way to go. And there are a lot of tools within AutoCAD that even simplify the process of drafting the design. So that's been certainly a game changer in the industry.
When it comes to particular risks associated with some of your projects, I mean, you're dealing with multi-million-dollar projects that are impacting lives on a day-to-day basis. What are some of the risks and issues you've dealt with in the past during projects? How have you handled those difficult situations when it comes to safety protocol, when it comes to just the design implementation, pedestrian safety? I mean, you're a part of an elite committee, you're involved with the community, and if anything happens with the highways or the roadways, you and your organization are the ones that people typically call.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. There is risk, and there have been several situations through my career where we've had to be very careful to take care of those risks. Some of them come up in the design process. We live in a very litigious society, and even if our design was 100% correct, that doesn't mean that a court won't look at processes and make sure that we've followed our quality control program. And I know of cases where, designs were fine, but because somewhere in an approval process, not at my present firm, but at other organizations, there was a signature that was missed in the process of going through the approvals. There was a judgment for a harmed party. We come across a number of different challenges in the field during construction where we come across unexpected circumstances. Maybe we're installing guardrail and come across something that prevents it from being installed the way it was designed. So we've got to collaborate with the contractor, with the property owner, which is often the town or the city, and the guardrail provider to come up with an alternate design that meets all the necessary criteria and accomplishes what we need to accomplish. So it's really a collaborative resolution towards the field issues that come up. But in the office, it's important for us to follow our quality control, quality assurance guidelines, our process, make sure that everything gets looked at and reviewed before it gets out on the street.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that you mentioned having a quality control metric throughout the organization to be able to ensure that every single deliverable that is going through your organization is met with this criteria. And I think for businesses as a whole, it's so important that there is some sort of quality control checks. I think if we want to fast forward it to now where we have electric vehicles and automated vehicles and even driverless vehicles, how might automated or driverless vehicles impact highway infrastructure? That's
a fascinating topic as well, Keenan. One that I'm not necessarily expert in, but it's one that does impact the industry. As you look at starting with automated vehicles, there are things that need to be considered. Some of the automated driver technology relies on the ability for the car to, quote unquote, read street signs, roadway pavement markings, looking for crosswalks and things like that, so they can identify pedestrians and avoid, hazards. So these are things that will need to be developed and considered. One thing that has been around for quite a while is the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It started in 1935 and created national guidance for pavement markings and signs. And I bring that up because even the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, affectionately referred to as the MUTCD, has evolved. It started with paint pavement markings, the idea of a yellow center line and white edge lines, and then the need to make them more visible and more durable. So they've gone from paint to a thermoplastic, which is kind of a melted plastic that gets laid out on the road, and there are different other materials that they're used now, like epoxy and others. But when the paint and the thermoplastic are applied, there's actually glass beads that are laid into it to make it more retroreflective. And these are the kind of things that will help to make pavement markings more visible to the automated technology. So yeah, it's just it'll be important to make sure that when automated driving becomes commonplace, that I believe the automated driving technology needs to be able to see, the equipment and the traffic controls and different things on the road. And that's definitely going to be an impact in the industry.
Awesome. How about electric vehicles? You had mentioned earlier that there may be some adjustments that need to be made relative to EVs.
Yeah, true. Electric vehicles are pretty fascinating. It's kind of cool that you can plug your car in, charge it up, and, take off. It's a little, it can sometimes be a little unsettling when you hear or don't hear an electric vehicle approaching. But as far as the infrastructure goes, a couple of the things that need to be considered with the increasing popularity of electric vehicles. Obviously, the big need is going to be having appropriate charging stations, an adequate number of charging stations for cars. We've got gas stations everywhere, but charging stations aren't yet as prevalent as they probably need to be. I'm guessing that they will eventually come up with technology that allows you to charge your car a lot more faster, than having to sit and wait. But I'm guessing that technology will advance. The other thing that comes into play, and I've heard about this recently, is the idea of guardrails. That's another area where innovation has been continual. There are different agencies, particularly, AASHTO that I mentioned earlier, the American Association of State and Highway Transportation Officials. They've kind of been monitoring guardrail installations, length of need, and, where do you need it? What hazards do you need to protect with it? And one of the goals is to make sure that you're not creating more of a hazard than what you're protecting against. So there've been a few regulations that have guided development, design, and installation of guardrails. Most recently, the method for attaching safety hardware acronym is MASH. So lately it's been MASH compliant guardrail. And when MASH compliant guardrail came into play, I think it was probably 5 or more years ago, it was a little bit higher than the previous guardrail. The beams were attached at the center instead of at the post. There were a couple of different things that were different about a MASH compliant guardrail as compared to the previous version. And one of the reasons it was a little bit higher was because you had bigger vehicles. There were more SUVs, things like that. But one of the things that they're realizing is that with the electric vehicle, with the battery base, electric vehicles are a lot heavier than today's vehicles. So guardrail will need to be reconsidered because today's guardrail doesn't necessarily meet or provide the impact absorption necessary for these heavier vehicles. The heavier cars, heavier trucks, when buses and trucks go electric, they're obviously much more heavier than they are today. So guardrail is something that's going to need to be reconsidered with the onset of electric vehicles.
Yeah, that's very interesting that, guardrails and some of these other implications will need to be adjusted to meet the changing needs of those that will be purchasing vehicles in the next 5-10 years. Do you see that also changing with traffic signals? I know we've also discussed prior to our conversation now that Mr. Morgan's original patent was also adjusted over the period of time. Is there any changes that you see there in the near future?
In traffic signals?
Yeah.
Yeah. With Bluetooth technology, with wireless communications and digital advances, if you look around, some of the older traffic control signals, they were analog and they had the gears inside and they had to, they'd tick off and change the light when necessary. And, some of the, more recent, the more current contemporary signals, they're digital. So they've got computers and they're calculating and trying to optimize, the green time for the busiest approaches and provide the adequate yellow and red time for traffic to clear the intersection before the next approach gets their green light. And we're reaching an advent where they have advanced traffic signals. And I don't know enough about those. I'm not the traffic guy, but, they communicate with one another. They kind of adapt, to current traffic situations, for further optimization. And it's kind of fascinating what they can do with those. And As far as the digital communication, I mentioned the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth. You can have with your automated vehicles, you'll have your vehicles talking to each other. One of the things that they're looking at or have been looking at is platooning. If you've got a truck lane on the highway, you can have your trucks talking to each other so they know what speed each are traveling at. And you can optimize the efficiency of that lane by having all the trucks travel at the same speed. They can travel closer, and as they stop, they can all stop together, so there's less risk, higher efficiency, theoretically more productive travel. And you see pieces of this throughout, the different elements of transportation engineering.
Gaining a lot of valuable insights and perspectives from this riveting conversation? Leave us a comment. We would love to hear from you. Now, let's leap back into this engaging conversation.
Very interesting. Can you share any innovation in transportation development? What areas are you most interrelated with?
I guess most of my projects where I'm most directly impacted by innovations or new developments are more in the geometric design. Part of that being the complete streets that I mentioned earlier, trying to make sure that pedestrians, bicyclists, and other users are better accommodated in our designs. One of my favorites, though, is probably the roundabout. I know that the roundabout gets mixed reviews. There are a lot of people that when you mention the word roundabout, their face kind of sours and they groan a little bit and they're like, but realistically, the modern American roundabout was introduced in the 1990s. So a lot of what we have today are traffic circles or rotaries, thinking specifically about, maybe the Cape Cod rotaries that were in place for, many years. But the modern American roundabout is one that, by virtue of the paper markings, by virtue of the fact that the approach is flare, and that the drivers entering the roundabout have to yield to those that are already in the roundabout, make it a safer intersection than any other type of intersection, be it a signalized intersection, a four-way stop. When you consider the angles of approach and things like that, it's designed so that, yes, there may still be accidents, but the severity is significantly decreased. So it's just kind of a cool intersection. And there are even other innovations in geometric design of highway interchanges and things like that are pretty amazing. One of those is the diverging diamond interchange. And if you get a chance, you can Google it, diverging diamond interchange. And what it does is it acknowledges that many of the accidents that occur at intersections, certainly some of the more severe accidents, are due to left turns. This is going to be hard to describe verbally, but what the diverging diamond interchange does is basically eliminates left turns. So if you're looking at a highway and you've got an intersection on each side of the highway as the ramps come down and meet the road that's underneath it, at that intersection, the roads cross over. So now as you cross over that highway, you're on the wrong side of the road, if you will. So that instead of taking a left to get over to that side, you're crossing straight through an intersection. And again, it's very hard to describe, but it's a fascinating concept for an interchange. And there are some that have been built. I think the first one was in Springfield, Missouri, probably a decade or so ago, if not more.
Awesome. And I'm just so grateful for just the wealth of information, but your perspective as to how we're going to be changing the way in which that we transport from one location to another. But as we sort of reach the conclusion of our conversation today, is there any particular innovations that you are just excited about when it comes to your particular field that you would like our audience to be aware?
Yeah, Keenan, the one thing that is probably exciting, and I think there's a lot of promise in it, and I think, there's a lot of hope in it. Federal Highway Administration recognizes that, even one death on our transportation system is unacceptable. So they've taken on a program called the Safe System. And zero is our goal. A safe system is how we get there. And it's a plan, it's a program that they want to be considered. It's an approach, if you will, towards design and managing roadway infrastructure that looks at a few different things. in order to work towards that goal of 0 deaths. And certainly, safe vehicles is one. So we'll continue to see vehicles evolve with more safety elements, more safety equipment, safer materials, safer construction, safer operation, safe speeds. We want to design our roads for speed. You may not realize it as you're driving around, but there are elements of roadway design that can guide speeds. And we want our roads to be safe, which speaks to the geometric design of them and making sure that, pavement markings are visible and reflective. Post-crash care is obviously another element that contributes to 0 deaths. And then safe road users. So there needs to be, an education aspect that teaches people, how to be safe users of the road. But if we can do that, if we can design safer vehicles, safer roadways, educate users on how to use the roads, then we can work towards minimizing, the number of serious injuries and deaths on the roads.
Amazing. Well, before we conclude, Dan, are there any final remarks that you would like to leave our listeners with?
The last remark would probably just be to emphasize, the safe users part of the Towards 0 Deaths program by FHWA. And I always encourage my family to be very careful when they're driving around or using the roadways. And one of the most common emphasis that I make is not to assume that everybody's driving the way they're supposed to be. So as they approach an intersection, when they get the green light, make sure that everybody else is stopped before they enter the intersection. Because unfortunately, red light running and some of these things are huge contributors to the number of injuries on our roadways. So I would just encourage everybody to drive safely, to be examples to their families, and certainly to teach their children and anybody within their realm of influence to be careful, to, approach intersections slowly, to stop if safe to do so on the yellow, to make sure everybody else is stopped before you enter the intersection. Leave space on the highway, which not only improves safety, but also improves operation, because then you have room for people to merge from on-ramps, So just, be safe out there.
We sort of changed trajectories of our conversation because I think we spent a lot of our time really understanding a lot of the intricacies and the fascinating areas of your specialties. But I think for many of our listeners, they want to hear from you because you're definitely a strong leader. But how does faith integrate in your role as a leader?
It's a big part. It's a big part. I'm a Christian. I'm active in my church, and I've been on the board for a number of years. And because of my faith, I want to be a good example. I want to live in a way that is respectful of others, to be, loving toward others. I've got a sign on my desk that has paraphrase of Micah 6:8. It says, "Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly." And I try to manage and to work according to those principles. Act justly, do what's right, love mercy. None of us are perfect. So when we go into it, understanding that, it helps everybody. I had a document that I had to review recently, and I pointed out that something was left out of an appendix. And the young woman that put it together, she wrote back and said, "Oh, thank you for catching that. I'm so sorry. This is my first time reviewing." She could tell she felt bad. But I wrote back and I told her, I said, "Hey, look, we all make mistakes. That's why we have a quality control system where we check one another. That's what it's there for." So I wanted to encourage her, don't feel bad. It happens. And then walk humbly. None of us are as good as all of us. It takes all different types and all different skills and all different people, to make an effective team. So it's just a big part of who I am and what I try to do.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Dan Murphy, for being on the Omega Podcast.
Thank you, Keen. It's been great to be here. Good talking to you.